Well, in the first five today, I want to talk a little bit about what happened in Texas over the weekend. So I did hear prior to the weekend that there were all sorts of messages that are being picked up that Antifa was going to, and Black Lives Matter, they have been, locked arms, as they're both Marxist organizations. Antifa and the Black Lives Matter organization had locked arms, and they were going to descend on the city of Austin, the capital city of Texas. And they were coming from Seattle and Portland, where they just finished destroying those cities. And the message toward Austin was they wanted to burn down the police station. They wanted to try to burn down the Capitol, which we have a beautiful historic Capitol. Almost every state does, but a beautiful historic Capitol. And they basically wanted to set up the same thing they did in Portland or in Seattle with their Chaz or CHOP idea, that they're setting up their own little area. They're claiming they're in charge of it. It's their area. They have jurisdiction. Keep the police out. The same thing they were doing in the upper Northwest. And so, but fortunately for America, for Texas, and for the people in Austin, the Austin authorities had wind of it ahead of time. So they were very, 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 very ready for them. One thing that in Austin they did is that we have in Texas, not just for this occasion, but and other big cities do, but we have mounted police. We have some officers who simply ride around on horses, which actually works fairly well in a busy city with a lot of traffic. They can get around sometimes where cars could not. So in Austin, the police basically met the Antifa and BLM protesters and said, not here. This is Texas. We're not going to humor you the way you got humored in Seattle and Portland. Not happening here. And so the police actually prevented this setup of this Chaz, CHOP, whatever they would have called it, some new name they might have had in the state of Texas. Just said, we're not doing that. One thing that the police did, which I found very entertaining, was that they're on horses. So they physically actually had the horses, the officers on horses, dispersing this crowd, trying to take over an area. So I want to ask Matt the One if I send him a clip showing what happened in those areas in Austin where the Antifa tried to show up and disrupt. Okay, we can cut them off. I've had about enough of them. I wanted to show you how violent it got in Austin. I mean, it got really, really violent. I wanted to show you that much and share a couple of things that happened, because this actually segues well into what I want to talk about today on this show, which is we law-abiding, reasonable, patriotic Americans tend to look at every incident and every issue as unique. We try to understand what they're protesting. We're trying to understand what the point is. How can we fix this for you? Is there some way we can, make you feel better? Tell us what you're upset about. And so we respond to things like this, and in kind of a linear way. Protesters come, they said this, we think, how do we respond? And we need to, in our country, and it's not just the police and the authorities, but the average Joe American, the average Joe patriotic American needs to recognize that every single little story we are seeing, every incident, everything we're watching is simply the individual manifestation of the the anti-American Marxist left in their war against America. Just like in a major war, if you talk about World War II or any major war, you may talk about the battle here, the battle there. There are facts on the ground and all that. But the battle was just part of the larger war. Well, all that we're seeing many, many battles in this country brought on by the radical left, the Antifa, BLM, violent, rioting, criminal conduct in major cities around this country is just one battlefront. It's just one battle that the overall enemy, the anti-American Marxist left, communist, Marxist, socialist, call it what you want, Antifa, BLM, the entire radical left is using a multi-pronged attack against America. These attacks that we just saw what was happening in Austin, Texas, been happening in cities around this country. That's just one piece of the larger battle against America, one piece of the Antifa BLM Marxist attack on America. So we have to be able to respond in the larger context of fighting back, recognizing this is just one front in the radical leftist war and the destruction of America. So, for example, in other cities, the police have allowed people to riot. They've said, well, you know, they're really upset. Let's just let them get it out of their system. Let them go ahead and destroy a few things. In fact, that happened in 2015 in the city of Baltimore. You may recall after the death of Freddie Gray in the custody of police, there were massive riots and same kind of thing, destruction of property, burning of buildings and burning of police cars, a lot of really horrible violence, which, by the way, has not dissipated. But I want to ask Matt the Wonderful to play a very short clip of the then mayor in Baltimore, how she talked about what it was she was going to do with violent protesters.
We also gave those who wished to destroy space to do that as well.
Okay, they gave criminals space to destroy. I know that clip. She became famous for that clip, and maybe there was some attempt to justify or explain it. But I really want to get this point clear as we go through what we're going to talk about today on this show. America really is under assault. It is an assault on the very identity, the very fabric, the very meaning, the very identity of America. The left is using many, many battlefronts to do that. And if you are the general on our side, you have to respond, you know, to each situation, of course, and respond specifically to issues. But you have to respond also with a larger recognition. All these people want to do is to destroy America. So you had in Austin, I was very proud, honestly, kind of surprised, because Austin's a very leftist city. For Texas, it's a very leftist city. But they were having none of it. They were not going to allow these people to set up camp, to set up Chaz or CHOP. Wasn't going to happen in Austin, simply not going to allow it. You saw the people on horses driving the protesters away. They ultimately gave them warning, saying, you know what, folks, get off the streets. You're not allowed to block the streets. And if you don't get off, we're going to arrest you. And then they followed through. And the people either got off the streets or they got arrested. Something in the range of 36 people were arrested. And I'm going to guess in Texas, maybe actually prosecuted. But the point is, we do not have to humor lawlessness. A few of the quick points to wrap up this first 5. We become so accustomed to violence in this country that we've lost track of what it is that the First Amendment protects. The First Amendment protects the right to peaceably assemble. You absolutely have the right. Sometimes you have to get a permit, but you have the right to peaceably assemble, to get a group together and to hold a protest and hold up signs and say, you know, whatever your demands are. That's peaceful protest. That's protected by the Constitution. You do not have the right, no matter how angry you are, how right you think you are, you do not have the right to destroy property, to block streets, to destroy buildings, to burn cars, to even to block public freeways or highways. That is not included in the constitutional protection of the right to peaceably assemble. There needs to be a readjustment right now before we get to the fall, because we're going to have a raucous fall, my friends, a raucous fall before the elections come around. We need to recalibrate everything we think about protests. Yes, you can protest all day long, peaceably and orderly and in a way that does not interfere with the normal flow of traffic and the normal conducting of business. Just because you're angry does not mean you have the right to disrupt other people's businesses, lives, or harm their homes. The other little piece of what these Antifa people had in mind in coming to Austin was they specifically had threatened they want to go to the house of one member of the city council, Austin, who has not yet completely capitulated to the idea that in Austin they should defund the police. One member of city council is saying, well, I think we can cut the police funding. We can cut it somewhat, but I'm not too sure about this whole, defund the police thing. So these people who came into Texas from Seattle and Portland came here knowing already who in the Austin City Council was saying, not playing this game with you, not going to do this, not going to defund the police and enable your violence to continue. They were targeting her house also. Fortunately for us, for Texas, for America, you saw the way America should respond to violence and destruction. You cannot humor this stuff, folks. You can't humor it. You can't say, okay, like the mayor of Baltimore, go ahead, just vent, get a little bit of venting and then we'll be okay. It is the camel's nose in the tent. It is the foot in the door. It is the agreement. If you let that happen, just a little bit happen, that you aren't really going to defend the idea of America anymore. You're not really going to defend the idea of having lawful, orderly, civil society. You're surrendering to terrorists. Antifa, Black Lives Matter are terrorists. They must be treated that way. They must be crushed that way. We can have, and we will have conversation in this country on all sorts of issues that relate to our conduct of the police departments, any issues we have in this country, we can talk about, but we're not going to have these surrender to the crazies in order to make sure they don't get too mad at us. We need to be more like Austin, less like Portland and Seattle. We need to just say no to the Antifa, BLM, Marxist, anti-American terrorists. And that, my very fine friends, is today's First Five.